Hello, everyone. This is Shazad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. We're going to start in about 5 minutes, but just as a reminder to folks, there is a questions box that is available to you. If at any point you do have a question during the webinar, please feel free to post the question there, and we'll do our best to answer those questions during the webinar. If we can't do it during the webinar, we'll try to do the questions at the end. And again, worst case is if we can't do it during this entire session, we'll try to get in touch with you afterwards, or just email me directly or us directly, and we will answer the questions that you may have. So again, we'll start in about 5 minutes, so one after the start time. Hello, everyone. We'll get started in about 3 minutes. So just as a reminder, there is a questions box that is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. If at any point in time you have a question, please feel free to post that question there, and we'll do our best to either answer the question during the webinar or towards the end of the webinar. And also, keep an eye out on the chat window as well, as we may post some resources there for you to get access to some information. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the DMARC Bootcamp. What we've done so far at this point with the bootcamp is we've obviously finished weeks 1 to 3. So weeks 1 and 2, we talked about how to get started. So we just went into the DMARC overview at a very high level. And then the second week, we talked about SPF and DKIM in more detail. So exactly what they are, what they do, how to set them up, and why DMARC actually uses them. So what we're doing in these 2 weeks, 3 and 4, is basically going through DMARC in more detail in terms of what the policy is again, and what are the different components of that policy, and how you're going to create that policy. So we're showing this to you on different systems. So in today's session, we're going to be talking about bind and how to implement it in bind, which is basically a Linux DNS. So the first half is going to be all about the DMARC policy and how to create it and how to develop it. And then the last half is we're going to actually go on to the bind system, and we'll show you actually how to create SPF, DMARC, DKIM records on the bind system. And then tomorrow, which is October 3rd, we'll talk about how to set this up on a cloud-based DNS provider. So the first half will be exactly what you hear today. The last half will be about cloud-based DNS. We also really strongly recommend that people consider implementing DMARC during these last few weeks. So this way you have a chance to ask questions, and you can always go in and create that record and let us know that this is created. Is this correct? Is there something that we're missing or that we need to make changes to? And then you can also start collecting those DMARC reports. So that way during weeks 5 and 6, when these various subject matter experts talk about the different types of reports, what kind of things to look for in those reports, and where you need to make adjustments with SPF and DKIM, you can ask specific questions maybe that potentially impact your organization or types of activity that you're seeing, and maybe the subject matter experts can be able to help you answer those questions and resolve some of those issues. So this is what we're starting to encourage. So if you can put it in, please go ahead and start doing so. But by the end of the session, you'll have enough information to be able to do so. So let's go back to just to reiterate what DMARC is. So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. Right? This is what you're going to implement in order to provide a level of identity check for your domain. Right? You're going to use this to make sure that only authorized systems and with the appropriate authentication mechanisms are implemented and are actually sending messages. And it's not coming from fraudulent type areas. And if there is coming from fraudulent systems, what to do with those particular messages. So now remember, with DMARC, there's 2 parts to it. There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification. Right? The policy is what you're going to develop and put into place as the sending organization to protect your domain. And say like, look, we have DMARC, go through the SPF and DKIM checks, check for alignment, and make sure everything is good. And then if it's not good, then follow our policy accordingly and handle the messages accordingly from those fraudulent and the unauthorized systems. Right? In the DMARC policy, you actually have to create it. So it's not like a checkbox or a check mark that you implement. You have to actually create it and define it on your DNS. Whereas DMARC verification is something that the receiving side, the recipient, has to do. So technically, as an organization, you are a sender and you are a receiver, right? Because DMARC verification is going to check for all incoming messages to see if there's a DMARC policy applied to it, and if there's a policy, look up the policy. If it finds a policy, follow the policy accordingly and handle those messages according to what the policy says. So you are going to do both. Now for verification, we're not going to really focus on this in this bootcamp, mainly because the verification side is not something that you're really creating. You're actually just enabling it. So you're turning it on. It's a feature that you will be turning on. So if you have your email security gateways, some filtering type systems, some cloud email service providers, and cloud email security providers, you just have to go in there and see if they have DMARC verification capabilities. If they do, just turn it on. Some cases there may be more options, like they may give you the option of sending the reports back to the sender, They may give you the option to override the sender's DMARC policy, which you shouldn't do, but it does. Some tools give you that option. So go accordingly based on your tool and really, again, all you have to do is turn it on. And then I do strongly recommend that you send the reports back, because it does help those organizations make the changes that they need to make. So in this session, our main focus is just the DMARC policy, because this is something you have to create. There's different components associated with the policy. So you want to know what each of those components are and determine if those are necessary or unnecessary based on how you wish to define your policy. So some things that you may need. So mail server systems, you may need those. You probably need those more for SPF and DKIM. You don't really need to know those systems when you're setting up DMARC, but it does help to have that information handy. So that way you can make sure SPF is set up correctly, make sure that DKIM records are set up and signing capabilities are enabled. So that way you know at least that information is correct when you're implementing DMARC, and maybe even going up to the higher policy when you need to make changes to DMARC. Make sure you have access to DNS. So whether you yourself have access, so if you have access, make sure it's an admin level access, because you have to, in order to create records, you have to have admin level access to DNS. But if you're not the admin for DNS, make sure you know who is, and then also determine if there's a change control process. Because the thing is what you're going to have to do for most in those situations, you have to provide them with what the record that you want created and the information that needs to be implemented and put into those records. Right? And that's what we're going to talk about during this session, and all that information they're going to put in those DNS records. If you have it, a list of domains. I mean, it's good to have it. If you don't have it, it's not a deal breaker. That shouldn't be a reason to not do DMARC. Okay? If you have it, the only benefit of having this is, one, you can determine are any of these subdomains being used for email purposes, or not being used for email purposes, right? And this should only be public-facing subdomains, not internal ones, not the ones you're using internally, external, so publicly facing subdomains. And if you have SPF and DKIM, great, that's even better, because that will help you get through the DMARC process a little bit quicker. But say you don't have SPF and DKIM, technically you can actually still put in DMARC without SPF and DKIM in place, but only if you are at the lowest policy setting. You don't want to be at higher levels and not have SPF and DKIM, because you're going to break things at that point, right? Because the higher levels are where you're actually doing enforcing. That's where the actual filtering is going to take place. So if you're at the lowest level, fine, create your SPF and DKIM after you put in DMARC. You can perfectly well do that, but do not move up until you have SPF or DKIM set up correctly. So what are those different policy levels? So you have quarantine, none, quarantine, and reject, in that order, because none is the lowest, reject is the highest, right? Quarantine and reject are your enforcement policies. None is not an enforcement policy. Because what's happening at policy level none, you're putting yourself into what I like to call monitored only mode. And what that basically means is that, yeah, we have a DMARC policy, but our DMARC policy is not going to be used to filter out any fraudulent or legitimate messages. So there's no filtering going on based on DMARC. All we're doing is that I need to collect reports from the receiving side to determine, is everything set up correctly, right? Do I have everything in SPF? Do I have everything in DKIM set up correctly? Is domain alignment happening correctly? Are you seeing messages coming from fraudulent systems, or is it just the legitimate systems? Or are you seeing both? Right? Because these reports can have both. Well, we'll have both if the receiving side sees messages coming from IP addresses that are not authorized. Right? So then once you go through and review these reports, you make the adjustments to SPF, you add any DKIM records if necessary, and make sure you enable authentication on the third-party side, and everything looks to be better and looks to be working and functioning correctly. Then you move up to quarantine or reject, right? Because if it's not, if SPF and DKIM and alignment were failing, and your quarantine information, your messages go to the spam or junk folder. For reject, the messages don't even get delivered. So that's why don't necessarily jump to reject, because if you jump to reject and you're missing things, now you have a problem, right? Because those messages automatically get rejected. And it has happened to other organizations. In one organization, or probably one or two organizations, it actually happened to be the CEO's newsletter that ended up getting rejected. So that's a problem. So that's why start off at none and then work your way up to reject. You know, how quickly you do it, that's up to you, but make your way up to reject. Ultimately, you would ideally you want to get to reject if you can. So now what type of record are you creating in DNS? So the record type is TXT. That's where you're going to create a TXT record. I mean, there are some situations where you have your own DNS, whether it be cloud, bind, or Windows, but you can refer it to somebody else and point your DMARC record to somebody else because they can handle your DMARC records for you. Those situations, yes, it'll be a CNAME record, but that's very rare. It's not often that you would set something like that up. Primarily, and majority of the times, it's going to always be a TXT record. So now when you're creating these records in DNS, in some cases, again, that the record type, the record that you create needs to have a name, right? Not all DNS records have to have a name, but for DMARC, it needs and requires a name or a host name. And that's going to be _DMARC. It'll always be _DMARC. There's no variation of that. It has to start with the underscore and then DMARC in lowercase afterwards. And then depending on the type of system you use, you may have to put the fully qualified domain name in afterwards. So _DMARC dot and then your domain name. But again, that depends on the type of system and where, in some cases, it depends on where you actually place it in your DNS. That make a decision on whether you need to add the fully qualified domain name or not. But again, the key part is, though, the name must always start with _DMARC. Then after that, you get to define a value, and the value is what's defining and creating the policy. These are the components that my policy is part of and has in it, and this is what the receiving side needs to follow. So as you can see, there's multiple tags associated with it, and each tag has a different value. The other key thing to note is that each tag is separated by a semicolon. So you need to do that. You need to separate each tag with a semicolon. That's required in DMARC. So what are all these tags? Right, there's quite a few tags that are, and you see them all listed right here. So we broke them up into components. We said which ones are required, which ones are recommended, which ones are optional, and to consider using. So we're going to go through all of these tags. I have various slides for each one. But before we go on to those next slides, the first one. So V equals DMARC 1. That's the version that you're using. V equals DMARC 1. There is no other version of DMARC. The DMARC's capitalized. So V equals DMARC 1 in capital letters. So there is no other version for DMARC, especially when it comes to the policy. You may have read about DMARC version 2.0 or DMARC 2.0. That's not the version really. It's just people are calling it 2.0 because there's another standard that's been developed that can work in conjunction with DMARC. It's called BIMI for short. It's basically using an image for another layer of authentication. But it's nothing that impacts DMARC, meaning you don't have to make changes to DMARC. The only requirement is that if you're going to use BIMI, you have to have a DMARC policy of reject. Otherwise, it doesn't work. All right, but BIMI I'm going to talk about at the very last wrap-up session. I'll talk a little bit about it, give resources in terms of where you can find out more about BIMI if you choose to use it, which you should if you can. So the next few policies or tags. So the next one is P equals. So this defines your DMARC policy level, right? P equals, it's policy. So it's either P equals none or P equals quarantine or P equals reject. Cannot be a combination because you're only allowed one DMARC policy per domain. Okay, only one. Now you notice again, the tags are separated by a semicolon. So V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals, and then the policy level. The other thing is that the P tag has to be the second tag in your policy. So V is first, P equals is second. And then after that semicolon, you can put whatever tags that you need. And then you're going to use. The other thing to note about the P tag. So this policy obviously is going to apply to the domain you're creating the policy for. But it also applies to the subdomains of that domain. So the P tag not only is for that domain, but also they need any of the subdomains associated with that domain. That's what the P tag will apply to. Okay, so that's important to note. We'll talk a little bit more about subdomains a few slides later. So V equals DMARC 1 semicolon, and then the second tag has to be P equals none semicolon, and then the remaining tags you can put in as in any order. The next two tags, RUA and RUF. These are the tags that you use to implement and turn on reporting, right? Because these are the tags you're going to define. This is where the receiving side needs to send reports to in our organization. So that's where you're going to be sending this to, where the receiving side is going to be sending it to. So you put in after P equals your policy level semicolon, RUA equals mail to colon the email address semicolon, RUF equals mail to colon the email address semicolon. Now, a few slides back, we said that RUA is required and RUF is recommended. Technically, by DMARC standards, you do not have to have either one of these. So it's not actually required to put in. People just recommend it. From the GCA standpoint, we're saying at minimum RUA should be required. The reason for that is because if you just go with a DMARC policy of none, so V equals DMARC 1 semicolon P equals none, you've done nothing. Yes, you've created a DMARC policy, but you cannot do anything with that policy. You're not going to change it to quarantine or reject. You're not, because there's no reports to review. You're not getting the reports. You're not reviewing them. So how do you know when to go to quarantine or reject? So staying at just P equals none semicolon, not having anything else after that is pointless. You're not protecting your domain because you're in monitored only mode. The receiving side will see a policy, but say, okay, well, yeah, you have a policy, but since you're at none, we're not filtering any of these messages. So if they're coming from fraudulent locations, well, guess what? We're letting it go through because your policy says to let it go through. So this is why we're saying and requiring to have the RUA in there rather than making it an optional tag. By DMARC standards, it's optional, but from our GCA point of view, it should be a required tag. So put in RUA equals mail to colon and then your email address. And why is it the RUA one that we're saying is required as opposed to also having RUF? And RUF we're just saying recommended. It's because of the type of report, right? RUA is for aggregate, RUF is forensic failure reports. The aggregate reports are going to be the ones that actually have all the information in it. So meaning that's going to have the IP address of the system that's sending mail using your domain name. So regardless of whether it's a legitimate server or a fraudulent server, it doesn't matter who's sending it, that will be there. If the receiving side is seeing it, it will be in that report. It will be in that report. So it'll also have information about SPF. So is SPF, what's the domain? Is it passing or failing? And is it aligned? Same thing with DKIM. It's going to tell you what the domain's being used for DKIM, if it passes or fails, and if there's the domain alignment in place. So it's a good amount of information that's in there. So you can use it as an IT asset inventory. You can use, you're going to use it to update your SPF and update your update your SPF and update your DKIM or add DKIM records as needed. But then you could also use it in the cybersecurity perspective, where you can use the spammers and phishers, the IP addresses there, and you've confirmed they're spammers and phishers. You can add them to like a block list or a blacklist or however you decide to set it up on your end. So that's the things that you can do with this. So that's what's going on in here. So there is one question about is the plus addressing allowed in RUA, RUF? So I'm not sure what you mean. I think you're probably saying if it's like a DMARC plus RUA at address. Typically you don't see pluses in there. You typically see hyphens. Or if so, maybe I'm not getting the question or understanding the question correctly. I mean, if you mean, can you have multiple addresses? Yes, you can have multiple addresses in RUA and RUF. But before I get to that and showing you that, now RUF is your forensic report. You're not going to see too many of those. The aggregate reports you're going to see probably a good amount. So as long as the receiving side sends reports back, that's how many reports you're going to get. So forensic reports, you're not going to see too many of those because they're the actual full-blown message. So it's a full-blown message that you're actually putting there. You're seeing who actually sent the message, who the intended recipient is. You could potentially get the entire email headers, so you can see the full path, like the return from and everything, and so on. The route, the path it followed to send the message. You can get the actual message body, and in some cases you can also get the attachments. But it's the actual message, so it's not technically a report. It's actually more of an email sample that you're receiving. So that way you know which ones are failing and which are failing based on certain triggers that you may have in place. There's a privacy concern with that. So a lot of the larger ESPs, email service providers, and ISPs have decided not to send RUF just for that reason, because of that privacy issue and those privacy concerns. So that's why you may not see too much of the RUF. So how you set this up when you're putting in the email address. So again, it's just going in and putting in RUA equals mail2 : and then the email address, semicolon RUF equals mail2 : the email address and semicolon. Now the other recommendation is when you're doing this, put in a generic account for two reasons. One, when it comes to aggregate report, you don't know how many aggregate reports you may get. You may only get a few, but you could also get a couple hundred, right? It really depends on how many domains you're sending messages out on a certain time frame. Okay, that's what it depends. So if you can actually figure that out, that's a rough estimate of how many reports you're going to get. So if you send to 100 different domains, say in a 24-hour period, there's a possibility you may get 100 reports back, right? Because the assumption is that the receiving side, or those receiving domains, have DMARC verification enabled, and they're actually sending reports back. So use a generic account. And the other reason is because, remember, the DMARC records are publicly accessible. So meaning that anyone can do an NSLOOKUP or a dig command or search for your DMARC record, and they can flat out see your email address in there. So instead of having your personal work address in there, have a generic account, because again, spammers, phishers, attackers, they can look this up and say, oh, hey, here's an email address. Let's send some spam to this address. So if it's just going to a generic account, it's easier to separate those out because you shouldn't be getting anything on this account other than DMARC reports, right? Whereas your personal account, it could potentially get mixed in with other stuff. So take that into consideration. You can have more than one email address for either one RUA or RUF. Just separate them with a comma and make sure each email address starts with a mail2 : So like the example here, RUA equals mail2 : the first email address, comma, mail2 : the second email address. And then you can do comma, mail2 : the third email address, and so on. Just make sure you end with a semicolon before you go on to the next tag. Okay, and then also by default, you can only send it. You can only send to an email that's within your organization. Okay, you can put an email address for an external organization. You can do that, but that external organization has to do a little bit more in order to accept the reports. You can't just send it to the external organization without them doing some things on their end to receive the reports. So those are the ones that we're saying are recommended and required. So right, the V tag is required, the P tag is required. We're saying, GCA is saying that the RUA tag is required, but technically it's not. And then the RUF tag we're recommending. I mean, personally, I would say put it in because because it can help with some of the analysis if you do get any of those messages. So those are the 4 tags that you need to consider, that you need to implement. The remaining tags here that we're going to talk about in the next few slides are your optional tags. So optional meaning that you do not have to put them in. So if you do not explicitly define these tags, so if you don't explicitly define these tags, the DMARC policy is actually going to take the default setting for that tag. So that's what happens. So it's not like these tags are not being used. They are actually being used, but at the default level. It's just you didn't explicitly define that. So the FO tag is the first one. So the FO tag is basically going to be used in conjunction with the RUF tag because it has to do with forensic and failure reports. It's basically defining when should we trigger these? When should we trigger the sample messages and actually send them to you? So by default, it's FO equals 0. So again, if you don't explicitly define FO equals 0 in your policy, it will default to this one. So that means to generate a report if all underlying authentications fail to produce a line pass. Then the next options are 1, which is any underlying authentication. So it doesn't have to be all of them. It can be any one, so DKIM or SPF. Then D is strictly only for DKIM, S is only for SPF. So majority, I have personally never seen D and S actually being used that often. I've only mainly seen it for 0 or 1. Like GCA, we actually use 1. At some point, I'm going to probably change it to the default, but for now, I've just been doing 1. And I actually haven't seen any forensic or failure reports come in lately. But 1 or 0 are the two that you should really stick with. Then you have ADKIM and ASPF. This has to do with alignment. So it has to do with alignment. So we talked about SPF and DKIM in week 2, and we mainly talked about the verification of it, right? So verification is not alignment. So SPF verification is checking the envelope for the domain being used, then looking up that domain and making sure that there's an SPF policy and then following that policy accordingly. For DKIM, it's looking at the domain and the signature and then looking up that domain and looking up the public key and matching that public key with the signature. It's not doing alignment. DMARC is what's causing for the alignment aspect to happen and occur, right? So alignment at that point is looking at the envelope for SPF and comparing it to the from header to make sure the domains match up. For DKIM, it's looking at the domain and matching it with the from header to make sure the domains match up. If they match, that's great, it passes. If it doesn't match, there's a problem. But now what DMARC does is by default, it puts your alignment into relaxed mode or relaxed alignment by default. Because what that means is that in most cases, when it comes to the domain alignment, under relaxed mode, it allows for subdomains to be able to be used. Because there could be situations where DKIM is using a subdomain or SPF is using a subdomain, but it should be allowed. It should still be allowed because it at least matches the domain, even though it's a subdomain. So that's the default, and that's why it's the default, because this happens a lot with the third-party vendors that you may have those issues and run into, so you stay at the relaxed alignment. But you can put it in strict. But if you put it at strict, that means that those domains that we mentioned for SPF and DKIM have to be the same as the from address. There cannot be any variation. It cannot be a subdomain. It has to be the exact domain. Okay, so if it's a top-level domain, that means that DKIM and SPF have to use that domain. They cannot use a subdomain variation. Right? If the at subdomain, then the DKIM and SPF domains have to be that subdomain. So it has to be an exact match if you put an S. So how do you know whether you should use S or not? Really, again, looking at the reports. And the reports, again, it's going to tell you what domain is being used for DKIM and SPF and if the alignment is passing or failing. It'll give you that information in the reports. So if in your report you're looking at DKIM, everything is aligning, and the domain that's being used is always the same as the from address, then you're good. You can actually put in ADKIM equals S and or ASPF equals S. That's assuming that SPF is always aligned and the domain always is the same as the from domain. And again, if you don't put it in, either one, it can automatically default to relaxed. And they don't both have to be put in together. You can use one or the other. So you can put in ADKIM equals S and leave out ASPF, or put in ASPF equals and leave out ADKIM. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to use them both together. RF and RI tags. So the RF tag is for report format. So by default, those reports are always going to be in XML. Then what's going to change is the schema that might be used. Now, I have never actually seen the RF tag being used. But the cases that people may have used it is more for not the aggregate reporting side, but more along the sides of what you see in terms of the incident handling tools. So if people want to consume that into this, they can do that. They can choose between these two types of formats. But otherwise, I've never really seen people use this even for that purpose. But I've mainly seen people just not even put in the RF tag and just stick with the default of AFRF. So if you want to go into a deep dive, because of time, we're not going to go deep dive into the different formats. I provided the RFC values, the RFCs for each one of them, so you can actually go in and take a look at each one. But how do you know? I mean, if you're using those incident handling tools, go to that tool and that will tell you which one is the preferred format, if at all, if there is a preferred format. The reporting interval is RI tags, reporting interval. That's defining how often the receiving side should send you the DMARC reports. So by default, it's every 24 hours or 84,600 seconds. So this is in seconds. So RI equals whatever number of seconds you're going to put in. So be careful. Don't put in 5 or 10 because you're going to get reports every 5 to 10 seconds. So most people stick with the default, but I've seen cases where people will reduce it to a lower value. So more like along maybe an hour, just to help you get quickly adjusted, right? You can quickly update your SPF. You can put in DKIM where needed, and then be able to move up to either quarantine or reject for your DMARC policy. That's the only time I've ever seen anyone lower it. And that's not a bad idea. It's actually, it's just something to get, especially if you're already seeing a spam campaign, you may want to lower that number so you can move up quickly and move and protect your domain quicker. So that's what the reporting interval is. So it has to tell you the receiving side, this is how often you should send me the reports. And it may not be the exact time. It may not be exactly 24 hours. So it may be a little bit more, or maybe a little less, right? So, but it's approximately within that time frame. Then there's a PC tag, which is your percentage tag. And then what this is defining is what percentage of messages the receiving side is going to get and apply the DMARC policy to. So your options, your value is between 0 to 100. Default is 100. I would say, don't put in the PCT tag. Just use 100%. Because the main reason is because if you put in like PCT equals 1, 10, 20, 30, whatever amount, you don't know which messages are going to be impacted by the policies and which one are not, right? Unless you get those forensic reports, and that may help a little bit there. But there could be some failure reports that you're not going to get. They just may just pass right through. So you might not get everything. There's no way in the policy to find which ones to send and which ones apply the policy and which ones aren't applied to the policy. So you can't say that 50% is my PCT tag, and then the fraudulent ones are the ones that are not impacted, or the legitimate ones are the ones not impacted, but the fraudulent ones are the ones, because you don't know which servers those are. You don't know the IP addresses, and you're not defining that anywhere in here. Even in SPF and DKIM, you're not really defining any of that. But if you do decide to use it, and a lot of people have used it, I've seen cases where people put in PCT equals 10 or PCT equals 50. And really what people are using it more is saying, well, we're gradually working our way up to the quarantine or reject, because what we're basically saying is that, well, 10% of the messages are impacted, so we'll block those if they're fraudulent. But the other 90%, at least we know if they'll get through. So it's like they're treating it as like a safety net. But in all honesty, the best thing to do is just go full blown, right? Because then that way at least you know which messages and you can handle things accordingly. So because even the report will say that, well, this wasn't, the policy wasn't applied here, but the policies were applied here, but it doesn't tell you which specific message. But the other thing to take into note, if you do use this and you put in P equals quarantine semicolon PCT equals 0, that's the same thing as using none. P equals reject, semicolon PCT equals 0, it's the same thing as using quarantine. Okay, those are things to take a note, because you're basically saying that there's, none of these messages are going to be quarantined if they're fraudulent or if they're not passing DMARC. But that's like putting in none, P equals none. Same thing with reject and 0. So it's going to go to quarantine. At least that way messages are being quarantined. Then the last tag is the SP tag. So the SP tag is going to be something that you want to consider. It is optional, but it's something to consider, right? Because the P tag, what we had said there, that applies to the domain you're setting the policy for, but also applies to the subdomains for that domain as well. So the non-quarantine and reject will apply to the subdomains. So you can put in the SP tag, and the SP tag will use the same policy levels of non-quarantine and reject, but applies it to the subdomains. So why should you consider using this? And that's where that list of subdomains can help. If you have subdomains that are publicly accessible, but they're not being used for email, for email purposes, right? Or even if you don't have any subdomains and you know they're not being used and you don't even have any, put in or add in the SP equals reject tag. Why? Because you're working at P equals none for your domain. You're making the changes, adjustments, whatever, but at least now your subdomains are protected, especially the ones that are not being used for email. And even if you don't have subdomains, you're preventing people from potentially using those subdomains in email campaigns. Now, it could also be the other way around, where you can have multiple subdomains and they're actually being used for email purposes. And it becomes especially tougher if it's on a global level, because then at that level, or if it's on a national or global level, right? Because those locations probably have their own IT shops as well, and they're the ones responsible for email. So you're now ready to go up to reject or quarantine with a top level domain. But if you do that, it impacts your subdomains, right? And those messages are going to get rejected or quarantined because you didn't put in, they didn't have anything in place. They don't have SPF or DMARC or DKIM in place. So what you can do is put in P equals reject or P equals quarantine, but then add the tag SP equals none. So that way this policy is now not impacting the subdomains. And then at the subdomain level, they can have their own SPF, they'll have their own DKIM records, and they can have their own DMARC policy. So they can go through the whole process, be at P equals none, and then work their way up to reject. So that's why you want to take a look at the SP tag and actually consider using it, even though it is optional. So those are all the tags. Those are all the information that you have. So like I mentioned in the beginning, all you need is the V, the P tag, the RUA tag, and then also the RUF is something we recommend putting in to get started. That's all you need to go into your DNS, create this TXT record, and there you go. And that's what we're going to do next. So we're now going to go to our buying system, and I'm going to show you how to do this. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to use Office 365 to help us create some of these records and define some of these records. I'm in a bind window using a terminal connection, so I'm actually SSH'd into my bind system. So depending on your environment, you may have direct access to the system, so you can actually be on the system itself and typing in these commands. Again, it all depends on how you have your setup, but we're going through the command line and we're going through a terminal window in this situation. So now what we do is in order to access the bind information, you have to go to etc/bind. This is where all your bind information is. So even for your local and depending on how this is set up, this for your external and public side facing stuff, that information will be in here as well. Because remember, the DNS records have to be created on the public facing DNS system. Public facing DNS. So if you have internal and external DNS, it's the external DNS because that's the one that's public facing. So now in bind, you have to go into your zones folder to see your zone. So here's where all our information is going to be. So I'm going to go into this file, it's db.gotdmarc.org. So I'm going to use sudo. Sudo is the root command. So I'm going in saying that I'm actually going in as root. Even though I am the admin and logged in as an admin, you still need to use the sudo command because it's a safeguard. That way the admin just can't go into a file and start making things. They're acknowledging the fact that I need to go in as admin to make the changes. So I'm going to go sudo. I'm going to use an editing tool called Nano. You can use VI. If you're familiar with VI, that works perfectly well, fine as well. and go db dot, and then go in, and here is my bind file for this organization. So it has all my information in terms of my A records, my star of authority, my mail exchanger servers, and then other things. Now, one thing to take into account, not all bind systems will have this, but if you have this one line that I'm highlighting, so the $origin.dmarc.org or $origin your domain name, it's important to know if that exists or not. And the reason is because if this line exists, that means that anything that goes after this line, you do not have to append or add the fully qualified domain name. If this line does not exist, then you have to add the fully qualified domain name. That's why when you look at the items above, you see the full name. So host1.dmarc.org. Whereas below, you just see www, you just see mail, you just see FTP. So if I took any of this stuff and put it above this origin line, I would have to put in www.dmarc.org, mail.dmarc.org. So take that into account, because I've seen cases where this line does not exist. Especially when you're creating the bind, you have a bind server and it's newly created. This line is not always there. It's not typically something that's put in by default, but a lot of people add it in there. So just take that into account when you do this. All right, so let's go ahead and create an SPF record. And so I've already pre-organized this, so that you have the SPF record in here. The thing is also with bind, if you use a semicolon, anything after the semicolon is considered a comment. So be careful with this, because DMARC uses semicolons. So you have to be careful. So, but when we get to DMARC, I'll show you what you do in those situations. So now with SPF, depending on what type of system you're using for email, you can either just start creating the SPF record here. There are numerous online resources that can help you create an SPF record as well. So different setup guides that you can go through and go through the process of answer the question, and at the end it tells you what the record is going to be. But some third-party vendors and email service providers will actually tell you what the record is and what to put in place. Okay? They'll actually tell you what you need to do, and that's what we're going to do, because that's what Office 365, it actually tells you. But I can actually go ahead and start creating it here as well. But since we're setting up Office 365, what I'm going to do is go into the Admin Center for O365. In the Admin Center, click on Show All, scroll down to Setup. Under Setup, there's Domains. And this is going to tell you, these are the domains or DNS records that you need to have in place in order to be able to send mail using Office 365. So that's, again, assuming you're not managing DNS using Office 365, which tends to be the case for the majority of the time. So it'll tell you these DNS records have to be in place. So you have to have an MX record. So MX is a mail exchanger record. So it's basically saying this is the mail server you're going to be using. So make sure it's in your DNS. So it'll give you the priority level for it, a host name. And host name, if you see an @ symbol, @ basically translates to null or blank. So depending on the system you're using, you can just put the @ symbol in there, but in some cases you just leave it blank. You don't put anything in there. And then the value is going to be where you're pointing it to. So this record already exists. But now we have a TXT record that says to create. Create a TXT record with a host name of @ or null or blank. And this is the value for that record. And this is your SPF record. So V equals SPF1, include, and -all for a hard fail. So this is something that what I would copy and put into bind. Now, the other thing is if you already have an SPF record in place, remember, you can only have one SPF record per domain. So you don't copy this whole thing and create a whole new record. What you're going to do is just take the section that you need, which would be this, copy this, and add it to your SPF record. Okay, you don't take the whole thing, because a lot of third parties will give you the whole information rather than the bit that you need. So make sure you follow their instructions, but only take the part you need. Don't take the whole thing. So in this case, we copied the whole thing. And what I'm going to do is go back to my bind server, and I'm going to add this in. So now in this case, I'm adding it before the $origin line here. I'm going to add it before that. And you could add it afterwards, just put the @ symbol, but I mean, I tend to put it beforehand. So since I'm doing it beforehand, I got to put .dmarc.org in place in there. Then put an in, because you're saying in, and the type of record, text, and then paste the value in. And there you go. Now you have an SPF record. So at this point, I save the file, exit out of the file, and then restart my bind server. And now the SPF record is actually verified. So don't just save this and quit out. You do have to restart the server in order for this to be accepted. So sorry, not necessarily the entire server. You can just restart the bind service, and that's it. And you can restart the whole server if you choose to, but all you have to do is restart the bind service in order for this to be acknowledged. And then if I have to make changes, I just go in here, go back into this, and make the changes that I need. Because remember, if you look above here, I actually have 2 MX records. So I have the one for Office 365, but I also have another mail server. Right, so and I want that to be recognized. So under the SPF, I can go in and just add an MX. And that's basically say, look up my MX records and make sure those are included in my authorized list. So we'll go back and take a look at both of these. Okay, because what I could also do instead of putting an MX, I could put an A: mail.dmarc.org. But just realize that if I do it this way, that's going to count as part of the 10 domain lookup. I mean, if you do MX, it's also going to count, yes, but it only counts as once. So, but if you have multiple servers and you put an A: in each server, you're putting that towards the 10 domain lookup. So it's better just to use MX, because that'll count as one rather than multiple. And then this is also where I would go in and add any other third parties. So again, don't just add those domains in here. Don't just go include : and then spf.salesforce, .com. You may have to do additional steps, right? You may actually have to go in and enable authentication or enable authorization in order for it to work. So that's why I say follow the third-party instructions to see if there's that added step that you may have to take, right? Because not all cases you can just add it to SPF. You may have to do, verify authentication to actually turn it on the third party. So that's how, and then again, you save the file, restart the bind server, and there you go, you have your SPF record in place. Now DKIM. So DKIM, again, it depends on what you're using. So follow, again, if you're using a third-party tool or third-party system, follow their instructions, because the instructions also vary per organization. Because some third parties will say, okay, you're going to create a CNAME record for DKIM. Others will say, no, you're going to create a TXT record for DKIM. And I'll actually show you both. Right, so Office 365 actually uses CNAME records. So how do we do this? Because we have to turn it on. So what you have to do is scroll down in your admin center, go to Exchange. This opens a new window. Here you go to Protection, and under Protection you go to DKIM. And you'll see 2 domains, or if you have more than 1 domain, you may see all the domains. But something that you always see as the default that's already enabled is yourdomain.onmicrosoft.com. That's actually being used for DKIM signing. That's the one that's being used by default for DKIM signing. So even if your from address is at .dmarc.org, the DKIM signature is going to have the domain .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com. And it actually passes DKIM verification. Why? Because DKIM verification was checking for the domain, which is .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com, and comparing the public key for that domain with your signature. So that's why DMARC verification passes. What's going to fail is the domain alignment for DKIM, right? Because .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com is not going to be the same as your from address. The from address is going to be at .dmarc.org. 2 completely different domains, right? Not even subdomains, they're completely different domains. So that ADKIM equals R is not going to help in this situation. What you have to do in order to get alignment is you actually have to go to .dmarc.org and enable DKIM signing. So that way, instead of using the .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com for signing, it uses .dmarc.org for signing capabilities. But the thing is you can't just go in and enable it either. You actually have to go in and create the records first in DNS and then you can come back to O365 and enable it. And that's the case when it comes to a lot of third parties. They want you to put the record in first, then come back and click on enable or authorize domain or whatever option it is. So you remember, don't forget that last step, because this happens a lot with third-party vendors. People will put it in, but it won't do the alignment because, well, you forgot to press that authorize or the enable button. So make sure you remember to do that if it's required by those third-party vendors. But the nice thing in Office 365 is that you can actually hit enable and it gives you an error which provides you information. It tells you, look, you need to create a CNAME record. It provides you with a value that you need to put into your DKIM record. Okay, this is value, not the record name. Right, because DKIM requires a record name with underscore domain key. Right, that's required. So Office 365 by default, the name will always be selector1._domain key and selector2._domain key. That is what it will always be. So I'm going to go back in here and add it. And since it's a CNAME record, I'm going to add it in here. So now remember, when I do it here, because I'm doing this after the origin line, the $ origin line, I don't have to put in the rest of the domain name. Right? So if this wasn't here, I have to put in selector1._domain key .dmarc.org. But since this line is here, this highlighted line is here, I don't have to do it. So in CNAME, and then the value that I'm putting in. And then remember, for Office 365, there's always two. And you have to have both in place, otherwise it's not going to enable. Selector2._domain key in CNAME, and then paste this in. But just remember, it can't point to the same one. It needs to be pointing to selector2. So you can have multiple DKIM records. So hopefully that answers any question about can you have more than one DKIM record? Yes, you can have multiple DKIM records. So now in this scenario, so let me save this. These DKIM signing is only happening with protection.outlook.com. It's not working for mail.dmarc.org. Now I can have mail.dmarc.org and say, look, make sure all the messages flow through outlook.com. Because if you do that, then the office can sign it for you. But say in the situation, I don't want to do that. I still want this to be separate. I want it to be separate from MS Office for Office 365. So let me just go ahead and do this separately. It's going to send out mail on its own. So it's part of the MX record. It's part of your SPF, so it's fine. But there's no DKIM associated with it. So what do I do in this case? What you can do is use a tool called Open DKIM. So you can use a tool called Open DKIM. So whoops. So let me clear this. So it's a free tool. You can download it. It's actually a package that's part of that you can download for Linux. In some cases, like SendMail and Postfix can actually include this in there. Or if it doesn't, so depending on the version, you may have to actually go into SendMail and open Postfix and turn on DKIM signing. Just turn it on and point it to the right private key. So what you're going to do here is I'm going to use the sudo command again. And the command that you use you have to generate the key first. So the command is open DKIM -gen key. So that's the key, the part of it to generate the key. So -B is you're going to find the size that you're going to be using. So the size of the keys that are being generated. -D is to define the domain that these keys are going to be associated with. -D is going to define the location of where you're going to be putting these keys. So this is, for now, this is where I'm going to put it. What some people will do is put it on in a location that the mail server is. But in some cases, people leave it outside of that. So in case the mail server gets compromised, at least this part is still protected. So got dmarc.org. Sorry, let me move this over a little bit. And then you're going to find a selector, right? So Microsoft gave you what the selector name is going to be. So selector 1 and selector 2, that's the name. But when you're creating your own keys and generating your own keys, the selector name can be anything that you want, right? I can keep going with, I can go through the process and just call it selector 3. You know, or I can put in mail, I can put in default, I can put in the date without the slashes, so just numerical value, right? Those are the things that I can put in. It can be really anything that you want. I'm going to stick with selector 3 because I think I haven't used that one yet. And then after that, I'm just going to put it in verbose mode so that way I know what's going on. And I have one error before I hit enter. I put DM here. This should be just dash, it's just dash capital D. There's no M in there. So I just hit enter. It tells you that it's generating the private key. So if you didn't put the dash V, it'll just go next to the prompt. The dash V just shows you this additional information. So generating the private key, where it wrote the private key to, that it extract the public key from this file, and where it wrote the public key to. Now there's other steps that you have to take, like permissions and whatnot. I'm going to skip those steps because of time. But we're going to have a resource, a document that we've written up, and we'll put that on the resources page so that way you can use that document to write everything down. But now what I want to do is I need to take that public key information, so from this file, selector3.txt, because that's the information I'm going to take, copy, and put into my bind zone file. So what I'm going to do is I want to read it, so I'm going to do sudo cat, and then type in the location of where that file is, resides. So etc/open/dkim/keys. Oops, so two keys, got dmarc.org / and then the file name, which was selector3.txt. I open it, it shows me what the file is, and here is the public key that I need to put in to DNS. So the nice thing is I can just flat out just copy this and go right back into my bind zone and paste it in. Now remember, don't paste it before the $origin, right? Because when I copied it, it did not include the domain. So the domain is not after this. If you do not, again, as a reminder, if you do not have this $origin, you do need to add in .dmarc.org, okay? So there are the two files, txt and the CNAME when you're creating DKIM. So these you do not adjust. You do not make modifications to these. You only change it if for some reason Office 365 decides to do something different. Then you change it. Or if you're doing this on your own with a txt record and you decide to rotate your keys, then you would delete this. You would delete all of this and then add in the new one. Okay? Otherwise, you do not modify these. Now, how do you create a DMARC record? So what we're going to do is right here under txt, we're going to just go ahead and create it, right? Because third parties are not going to tell you how to create the DMARC record. They may point you to resources to guide you through the process, but they're not going to tell you this is what you need to create, right? So there's nothing in Office 365 that says, okay, this is what you need to create for DMARC. This is how you do it. Google won't tell you that. They'll point to resources. They point to other things to tell you how to do it. So we're just going to go ahead and do this. So _DMARC, that's the name of the record. You always have to start with _DMARC. Remember that. So all lowercase. In txt, because it's going to be a text file. And then this is where I start typing out my policy. Now remember, if I just go in v equals, so we always start off with v equals DMARC 1 semicolon. Right? I have a semicolon here. Anything I put after the semicolon is considered a comment, so it's going to be commented out. That's a problem because I can't just put in now p equals non-semicolon because the p equals none is not recognized at this point. It's considered a comment. So what do I do to fix this? What I do is I started off with a quote because it's basically they look at that anything within this quote, these quotation marks, is the string, is the value, string value. They're not to be treated as comments or anything other than that. Because you see, it's the same thing that what's happened with DKIM. They're using quotation marks here. So the quotations and bind are required. So I put my V equals first. My second tag is the policy, right? It has to be the policy tag. So P equals none. And now after this, I can go in any order. So I'm going to put in the SP tag because I want to protect my subdomains. I know we don't have subdomains for got.dmarc.org. I want to protect it. So therefore, I'm going to put this in. Then after this, I'll put in the RUA tag. So RUA equals mail2 colon, and then the email address I'm going to send this to. And then I'll do the same thing with an RUF tag. So RUF equals mail2 colon, and then the email address. So again, you really should be using a generic account. You shouldn't be using your personal email. But in this case, I am because that's the only email address that actually exists. Forgot DMARC.org. And then don't forget closing quotations. So I got to close it as well. Otherwise, it will error out. So this is my DMARC policy. So as you see, I left out the FO tags, the RI tags, and those other tags. Why? Because I don't need them. I mean, I shouldn't say I don't need them. It's that I don't want to do. I'm good with the defaults, so I'm not going to make any. I'm not going to put them in. So whatever the default is for those tags that I haven't put in, that's what I'm going to go with. But otherwise, I can add the tag and then make the changes accordingly to it. So again, I would save this, quit out of the file, restart my bind service, and now I have a DMARC policy for my domain. And then I can go back and make the changes that I need to make as well. So I can go back in this file and say, you know what, I'm ready to move this up to reject. So I'm just going to take out the SP tag and put in P equals reject, right? Because the reject will automatically apply to all my subdomains as well. And then I'm also looking at the reports and I notice that, hey, my DKIM settings, everything is aligning and it's always using my domain name. It's not using a subdomain name. So I'm going to add in a DKIM equals S semicolon. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. But I'm going to leave SPF out because I'm noticing with SPF, there's some things, wonky things going on there. So I'm going to let that stay at relax. I'm not going to even add it. Right, so the only time you're ever really going to go in and make modifications to DMARC, typically it's just the policy that you're going to change. But if you need to change any of the other values, you can always change those as well. So that's creating your DMARC, your DKIM, and SPF records. So now really quickly, I know I'm going over in terms of time. So what you can also do, so say that we have a domain and we don't actually use it for email purposes. So there's no email being used whatsoever. So I'm going to just put a semicolon here because that means it comments it out. Right, we don't actually use it. There's no reason for us to, I mean, we never use it for email. We just needed it to because we needed to have a web presence. We wanted to have a website set up. And we also wanted to use it for FTP. So what do you do in those cases? You're still going to create your SPF record and obviously create your DMARC record. You don't need DKIM because there's nothing that's going to be used in that situation for DKIM. So there's no reason to create anything associated with DKIM. So what you'll do is you'll create got.dmarc.org in still as a text record, but V equals SPF1 space dash all, and that's it. There's no MX, there's no include, nothing, because that basically you're saying is that we have an SPF policy and our policy says nothing is allowed to send mail on behalf of this domain. So all of those, anything you're getting using this domain name is to be considered a failure or fraudulent. So hard fail for all of them. So you want to have that in place because if there's sites that only have DMARC SPF verification set up, so recipients have only SPF verification, they can still follow this, right? So they can still follow this. But then you also need to create a DMARC policy. So just underscore DMARC in, again, still a text record, quote, V equals DMARC1 semicolon, P equals reject semicolon. And that's technically all that you need. But I tend to put in the RUA tag and define where I'm going to send it to. Just remember, you can't send it to an address that this domain is for, so like got.dmarc.org. I cannot send it to that. So I would actually send it to, if I'm sending it to a different account outside of my organization, I would just put in that address. Semicolon, and I could put in the RUF if I wanted to as well, and then close it out with a semicolon. So that's all you have to do. Now remember, you can't just send to an external address. They have to actually create something. So on their side, so in their DNS, so ignore everything that you see except for this one line. So let me see if I can just do this so I can clear it up a little bit. What you're going to do, oh, in fact, the line's right here, is create a record like this that you see right here. So at globalcyberalliance.org, in their bind system, you would create this tag, gotdmarc.org._report._DMARC in txt, quote, v equals DMARC1, semicolon, end quote. And that's it. Because this record is basically saying that globalcyberalliance.org is willing to accept DMARC reports for gotdmarc.org. So this is required in order to receive reports from other domains. So the other domain has to put it in their RUA or RUF that they want to send reports to you, and then you have to, on your domain, say that you're willing to accept those reports. This way, you can't just spam anyone with a bunch of your reports and just keep sending them over to somebody. The only one that makes an exception to this whole line of gotdmarc._report.dmarc is Google. So Google, you can still send reports. They'll send for whatever report reason, they still send the report through. I'm not sure why, but they still do that. So those are all the different things that you're doing and everything that you're going to be creating and setting up. So again, I know we're about 7 minutes over. Just give me a few more minutes just to wrap up, and we'll take some questions if there aren't any questions that I see on the questions box. So now at this point, the next step is basically go ahead and create your DMARC policy. Right now, I showed you how to create DMARC, showed you how to SPF, and I showed you DKIM as well. But start off at none. Create the DMARC policy of none, right? Because you just need the record name _DMARC. You create the value of v equals DMARC1, semicolon, p equals none. But don't stop at there. Put in, enable the reporting. Put in RUA, put in RUF. So that way you can review the reports and make the adjustments that you need to make and move up to quarantine or reject. But again, we are here to help you through this process as well. So email me any questions you have. Post it to the community forum if you choose to. You can post it there as well. Or if you want to, if you're working with us, we can set up conference calls. We can set up something where I can watch you actually put it into place. So that way I can see you doing it. So I'm not controlling it, but making sure you're putting it in the right location. So those are things that we can do with you and we're willing to help you with. Again, it's all for free. So as a reminder, upcoming webinars, if you're interested in cloud DNS, we're doing this tomorrow on October 3rd. So it's the same, the first half will be the same exact thing that we did today. So the first half is going through all the different tags. It's just the last half is going to just actually use Google Cloud DNS and Ionis or oneandone.com and show you how to implement these records in using those two cloud providers. And then weeks 5 and 6 is ongoing management. So report analysis, report reviewing, and what adjustments you need to make and where you would make those adjustments. So that's going to be very important in weeks 5 and 6 because that's the last component of DMARC. That's the reporting side. And these subject matter experts will explain to you how those reports actually work. So again, Q&A. So we are at 1:09 p.m. Eastern. I will stay on a bit longer just to see if there's any questions. But if you cannot stay on, thank you very much for joining this session. Please, again, feel free to email at either one of the email addresses you see there, and we can help you get started, or post to the community forum, and we can help you there as well. But it's not only me on the community forum. There are other subject matter experts on there as well. So I really see only one question. So if you know the IP addresses of your mail servers, you may want to flatten your record, especially, okay, so sorry, more of a comment. Especially if already at the 10 DNS querying function limit, yes. You may want to consider using the IP address, but if you put in MX, the MX is considered really actually looking up one domain, even though there are multiple records underneath it. Remember, those MX records actually will point to a host in most cases. Sometimes people put IPs instead of the host name, but it's also a host. It's not technically a domain that you're looking up, and that's in that case. You're looking up a host record now. So MX typically only counts as one. So yes, but if instead of using the A value and putting A colon and then the server A colon, the server A colon, the server name, put in the IP address as opposed to the A tag. And if you can, put in a range. That's even better, because then you don't have to have multiple A tags or IPv4 tags in place. So that was the only, well, really more of a comment than anything else. So there's a question about BIMI. If you can just email me, we can have a conversation offline on that, because I don't want to keep people on just to ask about BIMI. Because there is a BIMI working group, and you can actually contact them for any issues that you may have, or maybe that may be going on. So again, if you do have any questions, please post those questions in the GoToWebinar questions box, and I will do my best to answer that question now. But I'm only going to stay on for maybe another minute or two if I don't see any questions. If I see questions, I'll stay on till 1:15 p.m. Otherwise, we'll say in the next minute. If at 1:13 p.m. Eastern I don't see any questions, then we're going to go ahead and close out the session. Yeah, with MX, if it sees a domain, it's going to actually look up that domain, so it will count at that point. But if it's typically a host record, it doesn't really actually count it. So if you use an SPF checker and go out to the SPF checkers that you see, there's multiple in there, you'll see that it'll display it, but it'll still say that you're within the 10 domain limit. All right, so I don't see any other questions. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar and the session. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and I hope to see you in weeks 5 and 6.